Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on conserving wildlife migrations on private lands. My name is Catherine Semser, and I am a research fellow with the Property and Environment Research Center based in Bozeman, Montana. Founded in 1980, the Property and Environment Research Center, or PERC, is the home of free market environmentalism. What is free market environmentalism? Free market environmentalism is looking for ways to leverage property rights and market influences to conserve the environment in a way that benefits people, wildlife, and communities. One of the dominant issues that is being discussed within the conservation community today is the subject of species extinction. The International Panel on Biodiversity said that almost 1 million species may be at risk of extinction. And one of the things that seems to be driving these rates of extinction is the lack of connectivity between protected areas. In a world plagued by extinction, the connected ecosystem is the kingdom. Unfortunately, recent research from the University of Queensland has shown that better than 90% of the world's protected areas are connected to each other. This means that animals cannot move between one place and another to feed, breed, and raise their young. Fixing this problem, particularly here in North America, is key to meeting our goals to conserve biodiversity. And it's something that PERC cares very deeply about, specifically as it relates to our home, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. With that in mind, we've set out on a multi-pronged approach to look at ways in which private lands and private landowners can conserve the migratory pathways that big game and other wildlife rely on. That's what we're here to talk about today. I'm joined today by a panel of distinguished experts. The first is Whitney Tilt. Whitney Tilt is a PERC Impact Fellow and the author of the recently released report, Elk in Paradise, Conserving Migratory Wildlife and Working Lands in Montana's Paradise Valley. He is also the principal of Conservation Benchmarks, a consultant on natural resource conservation, and a partner in High Country Apps LLC, which develops interactive field guides for smartphones and tablets. Joining Whitney is Druska Kinke. Druska is the owner and operator, along with her husband Richard, of a family ranch in Montana's Paradise Valley. She serves as the chair of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group and is active in her community advocating on behalf of fellow ranchers looking to mitigate landowner-wildlife conflict. She served as chair of the Park County Elk Brucellosis Working Group in 2014 and is a member of the Citizens Working Group helping to develop a new elk management plan for Montana. We're also joined by Arthur Middleton. Arthur is a wildlife ecologist with a particular interest in developing solutions to human-wildlife conflict. He is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Bowdoin College, a Master's of Engineering Management from Yale University, and a PhD from the University of Wyoming. He also currently serves as a fellow of the National Geographic Society, a trustee of the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, a research associate of the Wyoming Migration Initiative, and is a science advisor to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. Finally, we're joined by Malou Anderson Ramirez of the Anderson Family Ranch. Malou also works with the Tom Miner Basin Association. Raised on her family ranch, Malou continues to manage that land today, raising cattle through holistic ranching practice. She is the president and founder of Teal Enterprises, co-founder of the Tom Miner Basin Association, and a partner of the Common Ground Project. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Montana State University. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Now, first, I wanted to turn to Whitney. Whitney, you just completed a very deep dive looking at the role of private landowners in the Paradise Valley in conserving wildlife migrations, particularly for elk. And I'll let you talk about it a little bit further, but one thing that I know your research revealed is that it's not always easy for landowners and elk to live together, that there are human-wildlife conflicts, sometimes to a greater degree than there are with wolves and grizzlies. And can you tell us a little bit more about this research report that you prepared, how you went about going about it, what your hypothesis was, how you went about testing that hypothesis, and what your research findings were?
Yeah, I'd be delighted. I got the opportunity to work in the Paradise Valley and learn from people like Druska and Malou and many others while we collectively worked on things like the Yellowstone River and elk and many other issues. And that kind of led to undertaking this research. So let me just take a few slides to show you kind of what we found. And so the research focused on the Paradise Valley. Let me see if the purposes were to assess landowner attitudes, to get insights into what landowners, really what kept them up at night, and to develop a needs assessment that really looked at how can we move some of these issues forward. This research was very different in that it didn't gather people's thoughts, gather their mental lint, and then take it back to a university or whatnot, and then publish it in some other magazine or whatnot. But this research went back to the landowners. Are we getting this right? How can we move this forward? So this research was really landowner from the ground up. It focuses on the Paradise Valley, which is that area of the Yellowstone River flowing north out of Yellowstone National Park through Gardner, through the Paradise Valley proper, and up to Livingston. We completed a survey. We spoke over a lot of kitchen tables. We spoke face to face and collected this information. And we had a response rate. We were targeting about 34 landowners that represented about 90% of the productive land in the valley. And we estimate that we got about 85 to 90% of the folks to respond. So I just want to hit a couple of the highlights here. So we see in this chart a piece of today's Montana and the Greater Yellowstone, in that we still have a lot of people who solely make their living from the land. But increasingly, we have people who don't rely on the land per se for their incomes, but derive that income from elsewhere. And so in the Paradise Valley, in our survey, you see in this chart, this bimodal that we have, about half the folks relying on the land very heavily for their income, and about half the folks not so much. Regardless of how landowners make their living, they were strongly in agreement with these two statements: to preserve properties as working ranches and agricultural land for future generations, and to maintain that as open space for wildlife and other uses while maintaining that agricultural use. Very strong ties there. The majority of these landowners, as Catherine mentioned, reported high use by elk and other wildlife on their properties. When they were asked, do they suffer economic impact, 81% said yes. Now, that impact varied from ranch to ranch, but many people who are producers in the valley suffer impacts from predominantly elk. Adding to this, Paradise Valley ranchers, and Druska will address this much more detail, but on top of everything else that plagues making a living in the ranch world, Paradise Valley lives with brucellosis. And that has a financial cost, time lost in energy, and the stress of trying to make a living and take care of your animals. All those factor into that. In addition to disease risk, and there's a good deal of property damage from gardens to fences, and poaching and other trespass is an increasing problem. As the population in Bozeman and other places grows, so does the folks coming out into the valley, not always respectful of private land. So let's look at, just taking it from a landowner perspective, remember the AOL was, you've got mail. Well, here we've got, congratulations landowner, you've got elk. You own the land, you manage the land, you're responsible for the land, but oh, by the way, the state of Montana, under public trust, manages the wildlife. And they don't always listen to the landowner so much as they listen to other people, such as those that buy licenses. And as one rancher commented during this research, I'm more than just another stakeholder. It's my land and it's my livelihood. So a lot of this was was repeated over and over again as we met with ranchers, as we talked about literally what keeps them up at night. So a couple of observations. Today's Paradise Valley rancher there's no such thing as one size fits all. They're in the ranching business. They're growing grass to feed cattle and haying for many different reasons. So one size response will not fit all. A majority of landowners report high use of elk, and many are very frustrated by the fact that there's just doesn't seem to be a very good way of managing it. More than one rancher has commented that even though they might live with gray wolves, they may live with grizzly bears, they may have listed species on their property, it's elk that they find the most difficult to live with because of the lack of flexibility in management. I don't know about other people on this call, but I found that very surprising that elk would be, singularly so singled out as a problem to deal with, to manage. And that's not just simply Paradise Valley. We're finding that statewide. Current relationships with partner agencies, you saw from that map that the Paradise Valley is surrounded by the Forest Service lands. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks manages the wildlife side of things. And those relations really have a huge opportunity to be improved. Too often landowners feel that they're bearing the costs of accommodating this wildlife with little to none of the benefits. Another observation is that we are seeing marked changes. These are anecdotal observations from landowners, not wildlife biologists, but the people that are out there every single day are seeing major changes. Elk are spending more time on private lands. They are migrating less. They seem to be responding to public lands because of the increased recreational pressure there. They are seeking more security on private lands. So all of these factor into it, and yet there's very little research data that can help support what exactly is going on. So we do have a sense of malaise in that, many landowners say, well, we've been through this before, we've had offers of help, but things aren't going to change. And so we really do need to be much better about incorporating the private landowner into our management going forward. So I just want to touch on a few of these recommendations that are in the report, and then I think we'll open it up, and Catherine can direct us through some of the observations of Jessica, Malou, and Arthur. But the recommendations really come down into three buckets: to increase landowner coordination and outreach. In particular, we want to really keep getting these landowners together so they can focus on things that are important to them. There are a number of ways we need to explore being better at providing financial incentives, whether it's a way that we can help generalize the brucellosis risk across a larger pool of risk takers. How might we engage the landowner in providing some form of elk rent, making it more that the landowners are an active part of managing this wildlife and they're recognized for it. And lastly, there's a great need for research and technical assistance, something that Arthur is very knowledgeable about. So with that, I appreciate the chance to share some of the research. It is encapsulated in the report that was recently published, and I'll turn it back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Whitney. Reading your report, one of the things that struck me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the challenge of living with elk was pervasive. You surveyed better than 85% of the landowners in the valley, and it was something that was widely reported that elk represented a challenge. And that really struck me because it wasn't a localized phenomenon. It seemed like it was something that was valley-wide. Would you say that that's an accurate statement to make?
It is localized, a density in the movement of individual populations of elk, but it is felt now throughout the entire valley. And the other thing is, when we ask landowners would they like to increase, maintain, or decrease elk use on their properties, 41% across the whole sample said decrease. But when we looked at those that are reliant on their properties for their income, that went up to 85%.
Interesting. And, you know, I think it's important to note, you know, these elk that people see in the Paradise Valley, these are the same elk that visitors to Yellowstone see around Mammoth Hot Springs when they go to visit in the summer, correct?
Yes, as Arthur knows better than anybody, Paradise Valley has two of the, I believe it's 9 herds of the Yellowstone super herd, both the northern herd that is the ones that like to camp out in Mammoth and the rest of the Lamar Valley and all. And then we also have a smaller, more localized Paradise Valley herd.
So there's a strong connection to the park, and you know, maybe that was one reason why the state of Montana, you know, wanted Paradise Valley to be one of the priority migration corridors conserved. You know, in the report that they submitted to the Department of Interior in response to the secretarial order on wildlife migration corridors. So there's a strong link, it seems, based on your research between the private lands in the Paradise Valley and the health of Yellowstone National Park.
It couldn't be more direct, and something that we really need to have a much more appreciation for is that Yellowstone is not dependent solely on public lands, but really does rely on those, especially for winter ground and all that, on the surrounding private lands, and therefore on the goodwill of those landowners.
Yeah, I think that's something that gets lost in a lot of the conversation. You know, we look at maps of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem and we see this giant, you know, blob of public land. But then when we look at that, you know, turned over plate of spaghetti of wildlife migrations, you know, we start to see how important the private lands that abut these public lands really are. Now, Druska, you own some of those private lands. And the other thing that really, you know, struck me about Whitney's report was the importance of the brucellosis risk to people who are raising cattle in the Paradise Valley, and the degree to which the risk is very real. Now we're in the middle of a global pandemic. You know, the transmission of diseases from wildlife to people has been something that's, you know, been front and center for a lot of people for the last couple of months because of COVID-19. You're dealing with a slightly different challenge with, you know, brucellosis being transferred from elk to cattle. And I know you've been deeply involved in this issue for many years. As a landowner, you know, and as somebody who's on the front line of dealing with brucellosis, can you talk to us a little bit about what it's like living with that risk, how real the risk is, and, you know, some of the possible solutions you see to mitigating that risk?
Catherine. Yes, so our family, we've probably been in Paradise Valley since the early 40s. So we are by no means the oldest ranching family in the valley. We're probably only 3rd generation. Some of the other ones that are there are 5th and 6th. So there's a lot of landowner history in Paradise Valley. We are a traditional cow-calf operation, so we sell pounds of calf. We calve, you know, in the winter and sell the calves in October, and then just repeat the cycle. So the ground that we have at home, we use to raise hay, to feed the cattle. And because our ground at home is not satisfactory, it's high desert type of ground, and whatever forage there ever was on it has been eaten by deer or elk. So there really isn't much there other than the irrigated hay fields. So, and we have sort of a dual-pronged problem in that we have the winter range at home, and then we take our cows up into the mountains for the summer, and we have elk there too. And the problem with, so in the late 1990s, keep in mind that we're right along the Yellowstone River, and we have never seen an elk on that property ever. And then the 1990s came and they reintroduced the wolf, and the elk behavior changed. Now, predators aren't the only reason that it changed. There's land use changes, there's weather, there's all kinds of other issues, but one of the biggest ones was the reintroduction of the wolf and the increase in grizzly bear numbers. And so those elk started looking for safer places to be. And when that migration started, the elk were at their highest number, almost 20,000 in that northern herd. And so we started seeing the edges of that migration in much greater numbers in September sometimes, but always by November, December, and then on through the spring. So when this originally started, you know, everybody was in awe of the elk and we all loved seeing them. And then, you know, the realization struck what they were carrying with them, and they became not very fun to see. So I always tell people that if you think brucellosis is a family bonding event, it is not. So what I mean by that is that, you know, on a daily basis, ranchers have X amount of things that they cannot control that they deal with. And so it's weather, it's regulation, it's any other issue that comes down. And elk is one of those, as is brucellosis. So because we live where we do, we are now placed in what they call a designated surveillance area. And that is something that APHIS created and indicated to the state that any area that has diseased wildlife and cattle also has to be a designated surveillance area for this disease. And so the producers that are within the DSA in Park County, Gallatin County, Madison County, and Beaverhead County are all subject to more regulation than any other cattle producer in the state. So that creates a set of hardships. If it was as simple as let's vaccinate your cattle, we'd all be in good shape, except for the fact that our vaccination is not very good. And so that vaccine that we use is called RB51, and it's a modified live. And what that means is that the old vaccine, which was strain 19, was actually the live material, and it also infected a number of vets when they would give it because they would accidentally prick themselves. So that created undulant fever for the human variety of brucellosis, which was an issue and still is actually today. But the vaccine that we use on cattle, which is RB51, is probably only 65 to 70% effective against preventing the disease, and actually has a higher percentage of effectiveness at preventing abortion. So we have a vaccine that is not very good for efficacy, and it's the only tool that we have vaccine-wise. The other tools are spatial separation, and that's very difficult to achieve. So our place is small. I consider it small relative to a lot of the other ranches in the valley, but we happen to be the first in line as the migration hits. And so when this migration started, we originally thought that if we hazed very heavily and kept the elk back towards the game range that exists in that area and kept them off of us, then we would also be protecting the valley, because what was north of us then would not see this migration. That worked for a few years until the migration ended up being resident elk. And so we have a lot of elk that migrated to the valley that have become resident elk. And that's a problem because they never leave. Now, and they've actually lost what I consider the institutional knowledge on how to migrate. And so the elk just stay and they calve in your hay fields and they eat your hay. And the result of that is, you know, places like, we have a place called Dome Mountain Game Range, which is run by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. It is specifically winter range for elk, and those elk eat it in the summer and the early fall, and it is not there for winter range. So even when the elk migrate to what is supposed to be their feed ground, basically, it's already gone. And so they have to keep going, and they hit the ranch lands really hard in the river bottoms. And so these elk don't leave, they commingle with cattle. And it's interesting to note that as the years progressed, this 20,000 head elk herd of Northern Migratory out of Yellowstone National Park actually got reduced to less than 4,000. And even with that reduction in numbers, the seropositive rate, and so the seropositive is the actual exposure to brucellosis that has happened with that elk. So the seropositive in elk originally with 20,000 head was in the 3 to 4% range. Now with less than 6,000 head, it's almost 30%. So you can see what we're up against as far as, you know, even though the numbers are smaller, the infection rate or the exposure rate is much higher. And so what that means for a rancher is you go out, start your day, you're trying to be positive, and the first thing you run into is an elk. And you think, oh my gosh, what are we going to do now? Because they can't commingle. And if they do commingle, you have the possibility of a brucellosis transmission. And then that transmission means that you would be quarantined. And if you're quarantined, you're held, you cannot sell anything for at least 3 months. And usually it extends longer into 4 and 5 months. And once you are an identified herd, they draw a circle around you a mile wide, and any other rancher within that mile becomes a contact herd, and they also have to go through a testing protocol. So it becomes very wide ranging on the effects, and the stress on the people and the animals is extremely difficult to describe, to actually get anyone to understand what it's like. But I walk every single day on our property, and the days that I see elk, it's bad. It's bad stress-wise, it's bad for the cattle, and it's bad for the elk. So, so what brucellosis does on our place is create stress. And then when I look at the bigger picture of the fact that our property is in the DSA, we are highly regulated, I don't see any changes on the horizon for what we do with elk that are diseased. I think about future generations, and I think, do I really want my son to take over this ranch in this place with these kinds of constraints? And the mom in me says, no, it's too hard and it's not going to work. But what else do you do? And so I think probably one of the reasons we haven't sold yet is because we do have kids. There's a possibility that they'll want something, but it's really, really hard to effectively ranch in Paradise Valley. And where migration and elk are concerned, and where the public wildlife is the issue, people need to understand that if ranches are not there, if we give up because it gets too tough, then what you're going to have is development. You'll have a fragmented landscape. And where will the elk go then? So we need to all work at this problem together, but that's extremely hard too, because traditional ranchers are not good at working together. They want to be left alone. They want to just do their work because that's what they love. And in this day and age, you don't get to do that anymore.
Thank you, Dreska, for painting that picture for us. I think, you know, what you're bringing to the forefront is a story, a reality that is too often overlooked, you know, as we talk about conserving wildlife in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I think for our audience, you know, the big, you know, development is a big concern. And it's one of those concerns that's shared by both ranchers, you know, and environmentalists. And Arthur, I want to turn to you because, you know, you've been looking at conserving wildlife migrations, you know, throughout the entire Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And you've got some insight into the importance of private lands, you know, in maintaining connectivity on the larger scale. You know, what happens if we start to see one ranch after another start to fall to some type of development? You know, what does that mean for the elk? What does that mean for the pronghorn? What does it mean for the overall health of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem if the development that Dreska just, you know, spoke about starts to become the norm instead of the exception?
Well, thanks, Catherine and PERC, and to the other panelists for joining with me here and having me, and to those who are listening. Thanks for attending and paying attention to these issues. So, Catherine, I think one way into answering that will involve me sharing a few maps just to sort of show the big picture. So can I share my screen? Okay. So let me do that here. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here, I've just got a few maps, and this information's sort of already been referenced, but I think a map is helpful just to talk about the scope of the phenomenon that we're talking about when we talk about these migrations. And so here you're seeing a picture of sort of representative individuals with emphasis on the migrants, not so much the residents that came up in Jessica's comments, but these shorter and longer distance migrants within these major elk herds that use the Yellowstone, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem and its landscapes. And so these data are, this map is really based on data that's been collected and shared by a number of researchers and agencies in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, as well as the federal agencies, the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, to kind of paint this bigger picture. And what you're seeing here is basically the movements of, in this case, 9 migratory elk herds from these outlying winter ranges, which are sort of the outermost portions of the squiggly lines, up into summer ranges in the higher elevation wildernesses and parklands at the core of the ecosystem. And so these herds range in size from a couple thousand up to 10, 11, 12,000 individuals, depending on which herd, and probably about 20 to 30,000 migrants that are encompassed by these herds. Of course, as we talk about the northern herd and the Paradise Valley, we're talking about the dark green and kind of rust colored lines in the upper portion of this map. But here you can sort of see that bigger picture. These animals begin to move up into the high country with the snow melt and the green up in the spring around the middle of May, and come back down with the first deeper snows of autumn and winter in early November on average. So I just wanted to say, before diving into that question, Catherine, and the importance of the incredible importance of the private lands in the ecosystem, you know, what is it that we're talking about here? Because we talk about big game, or we talk about, you know, elk, but I think it's important, and I'm going to pick up on this note from your question, to recognize what we're talking about here is a really fundamental phenomenon and fundamental creatures, you know, in this system. This is what the carnivores and the scavengers that are so associated with this ecosystem depend upon. This is what many of the wildlife watching and hunting and outfitting and guiding businesses and associated hotels and restaurants gain from in this ecosystem. This is, in many cases, you know, these migrants are, and we're talking really about a complex of 6 migratory ungulates: elk, mule deer, pronghorn, bighorn, sheep, moose, bison. These species really feed the system, and in many cases, they are what a park visitor is seeing inside the park in the busy season, but then at other times of the year, they're depending on a whole range of lands, kind of a laundry list of jurisdictions and ownerships. Here I showed you in green is those elk migrations, but in purple and in this rust color are mule deer and pronghorn migrations. In the southern portion of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, this is just representative. If we had all the migrations mapped, we would see an extraordinary sprawl of lines across the map. But taking those specific migrations, I just want to show you a quick illustration of the land ownership and its complexity here. But I want to kind of obviously pop out the importance of private lands. Private lands are important to all of these herds. that importance varies depending on which species and population we're talking about. In the case of the path of the pronghorn, which I showed you on that last map, some of the really key bottlenecks, really narrow spots for these animals squeeze through, and if they're choked off, you could sever the migration. Some of those cross private lands. On the red desert hoback mule deer migration in Northwest Wyoming, there's about 48 private landowners whose property these deer cross. And then when we get back to the elk, these populations, the migrants in these populations can spend anywhere from 20 up to 80% roughly of their time in winter on private lands. I have not spent a great deal of time in the Paradise Valley, but I work over on the eastern side of the Greater Yellowstone. And here's kind of a quick and rough map of the multi-species migrations we see over around Cody and Meeteetse, Wyoming, encompassing pronghorn, mule deer, elk, and bighorn sheep, moving up again into the high country on the left, including inside of Yellowstone National Park. So the private lands, I will stop my screen share now. The private lands are incredibly important. And they're providing open space, and they're providing forage for these populations in almost every case. Ironically, when we talk about elk, and we focus on elk in these conversations often because elk are big, and they're sort of like the character in Charlie Brown, I'm trying to think of, Pigpen, coming down out of the mountains with, all the flies following them and the dirt and the dust. They've got hungry mouths. They've got disease, this important disease, brucellosis, that's such a stressor and a burden for many of their cattle producers. They knock down fences. They attract, hunters, sometimes trespassers who want access. They sometimes bring predators with them along the way, wolves and grizzly bears hunting their calves, etc. And so these landowners are providing all this open space, but in doing that, they are bringing into their midst a lot of these challenges, and many of those costs aren't well represented in our approach to conservation. And I would just say in Cody, Wyoming, I don't know about where other folks are, but this summer, a lot of headlines are about the sort of urban flight that's taking place, the extraordinary movement of people from cities looking for space and freedom, essentially out in the rural landscapes of the West. And so I would say that the concern about what happens when it becomes really hard to sustain these operations and livelihoods and incomes on private lands has sort of never been more pressing at least in my recent memory, as perhaps those land values and those outside pressures increase.
No, I think that's an excellent point. Working from home is becoming more and more commonplace in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and people are getting a lot more freedom to choose, where they live, so if they don't have to live near a specific office, and that can certainly drive, real estate development in places like the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. One thing I've been wondering, and I'd love to get, your opinion on this, since it's something that you know much better than I do, is you mentioned the word, open space when it comes to private lands. And when I think about climate change and the fact that climate change is going to be driving, shifts in habitat, it's going to be driving shifts in fire regimes, and that the landscape that we see today is not necessarily the landscape that we're going to see 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. Would it be fair to say that, we not only need to conserve the private lands where the elk and the pronghorn and the mule deer are now, but where we also think they might be, 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now based on those habitat shifts?
I think so. I mean, I think we have to talk about climate really in any of these conversations these days. I sort of tend to maintain a strong focus and emphasis in my thinking on land use change because, you know, if we don't have any habitat, it sort of doesn't matter how and whether the system evolves and adapts under different climate scenarios going into the future. So it's sort of both and, obviously. But yes, I mean, I see the migrations as being really key to, we don't fully understand how they're going to respond to a changing climate. We don't fully understand which species are going to respond in what ways. We see, for instance, we are starting to get a little bit of a picture of that. For instance, we can see that, you know, that pronghorn and elk tend to be on the more sort of flexible end of the spectrum. We'll probably see them be a little more adaptive and resilient. We can see that mule deer, for instance, are more on the sort of inflexible and rigid end of the spectrum in terms of their fidelity to where they like to be and what kinds of habitats they use. So we're getting insights. It's hard to know, you know, where we're headed in terms of responses of these ungulates to a changing climate in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but it sure does seem like, you know, building resilience of the sort that you're asking about into the way we think about conserving these habitats is going to be really important. So I would agree with that.
Well, good, because that's what I've been sort of preaching in my own conversations with people, that it's not just a simple matter of drawing a line on a map and saying, okay, we have a wildlife migration corridor here, our job is done. You know, it's about maintaining that larger sense of landscape permeability and keeping options open for the future, because we don't know which way the land is going to change, you know, because of climate and other factors. Now, you know, we're talking about conserving private lands, and Malou, you know, I want to turn to you. You're one of my heroines. I mean, you're doing amazing work on your family ranch up in the Tom Minor Basin to mitigate, you know, conflicts with wildlife. And, you know, I just want to give you, you know, the chance to talk about what you're doing on your ranch to help solve some of these problems that we've discussed with elk, but, you know, also with grizzly bears and wolves, and you know, how you're making it work on your piece of property.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for everyone being here and listening and following along. You know, we are one family of many families and ranching families around that are doing really amazing work. And even if they aren't necessarily seen by the public, you know, all of our great conventional ranching families are really stepping up, and we've always done some amazing work. So it's really important that we know that. We just happen to be sort of this voice in all of this. So yeah, we're up in Tom Minor. We're on the southern end of Paradise Valley, sort of looking down. We're one of the watersheds, headwaters into Yellowstone River. And so obviously, as most of you know, Tom Minor is a diverse place. Lots of elk for sure, lots of bears, wolves, lots of livestock, and now lots of people. And so that's been a big challenge lately. And so keeping that conflict not curving or hopefully curving, but not increasing is really important to us. My grandparents bought our ranch in the late 50s. We've been a traditional cow-calf operation for many years, and then now have gone to a partial custom grazing operation. And thankfully in that custom grazing, it allows us some flexibility to experiment with different classes of cattle, breeds of cattle, really experiment in all forms of different ag that hasn't really been here before. You know, it's always been a cow-calf situation. And so being able to take cattle out of the basin in the winter has really proven to be the way to do it. You know, we don't have to worry so much about hay and forage at that point. And so I'll go right into sort of what we do on the ranch, some of the things, and these are not tried and true. You know, these are, again, we've learned of all things when we live this close to wildlife, and bears especially, we've learned that change and adaptability is going to be what keeps us here. And that goes the same for elk, and that goes the same for us all, because we are all part of the same system. And whether that system is in human terms or wild terms, it really is all the same. So we are trying, it's really rooted in just trying to be happy. And we love agriculture. We don't want it to drive us into the ground and make us frustrated and angry and sad that we can't feel prosperous. And so we are just trying to stay open and learn as much as we can from the natural systems already at work. One of the things we're doing is consolidating our herds more. We understand that there are definitely times of the year, seasonality, that cattle should not be in certain places. We're up in the wild, the timber and bear country. We're raising prey next to Yellowstone Park, as my brilliant sister-in-law says it. And that goes with, bears and wolves, that goes with forage and hay and what we need for our cattle. So, I mean, honestly, I've said this before, it is our responsibility to figure this out so that we can keep these large landscapes here and intact and everything on it, including us. So consolidating herds, the great thing about that is with seasonality, we can move them. So depending on if den sites are active or if elk herds are down low calving, if all kinds of things, we're getting a lot of predators killing cattle in a certain ravine. We are changing our grazing plans based on those things. So taking a lot of notes year to year and understanding how things move. We have range riders, which I'm sure all of you know about. Range riding is a controversial thing. It certainly shouldn't be. Range riding looks different on every landscape, and it's basically what we've been doing for a long time. We're just a little more observant, and our range riders at least are out there conducting themselves in a fairly passive way. We're not out there being a dominant force on the landscape. We're out there to watch how things are going. We're looking for bird sign. We are just part of the system. And so we're finding that old way actually helps keep our losses low, or at least we're able to get compensated for those losses because we're out, we're listening, we're learning all about the things. We've learned that different breeds of cattle do better in different places. We've learned that different classes of cattle and a diverse herd does better. We've also learned that the way cattle are handled is huge. A predator wants a flighty cow who's going to run, and that's how they hunt. So we really take seriously low stress livestock handling. We handle our cattle, at least we try to handle our cattle as much as we can before they go out into the permits, so that they're just a little bit lower key animal. They know how to stand their ground. We cull cattle that don't necessarily come back with their calves every year after year. We're building strength in our herds, and they have these instincts that they just have to sort of be reminded about. Cattle are a lot smarter than people think. And then we're experimenting with some wildlife friendly fencing. Actually, these are grazing fencing system that we've partnered with NRCS on. But it actually ends up being a great wildlife friendly fence as well, because then once the cattle are out of those places, we can turn off the fence. They can move the way they should, and they don't need to get trapped in places or with young calves and so forth. So we have let down clips and so forth that make those fences almost non-existent. And that really helps with our costs of fencing and keeping our fences up. If we put those let down clips down, or if we just help try to maintain that 3-strand, we're finding that we don't have to do as much maintenance again in the spring when we're bringing cattle back. And then of course, a lot of wildlife data and collection. That's what we're just out there watching things and taking a lot of data. And, more recently, it's been really fun as a really, I don't know if many of you probably know my family, we're a pretty intense bunch of people, and we love our ranching, and we also love other things. We have a mixed operation. We have mixed enterprises. We really always have, and probably without ever really realizing that that's probably what helped us stay prosperous up here. And so now we're starting to step into the tech world as a rancher. I was out range riding and thought, why this has to be a better way. I'm literally out here looking for bird signs so that I can find a dead cow that I saw, some black hair and scat, so that then I can get compensated. But before I get compensated, I have to actually skin that animal with wildlife services while 5 grizzly bears are watching us, waiting. And, there's just got to be a better way. Like, just as Druska said, these are serious, real challenges and then that's just bears. That doesn't include elk. And so I started to think about some sort of tag. A lot of people are working on new innovation around collaring and tagging with animal movement. this is something we have to be open for. A lot of people will say, you know, well, does that take away from my old ranching way of life? And my answer as another rancher is no. You know, that train has come, and if we don't get on that train, we will not make it. So let's utilize some of these really cool new this innovative tools. I'm really lucky to be working with Jeff Reed in the Valley and other Fortune 500 companies, tech companies, so that we can really drive the cost out of collaring, of tagging animals, so that we as ranchers have the data of knowing in real time the wellness of our animals, whether that's in elk herds, whether that's calving out in predator country. I mean, the dairy industry uses these things substantially, and it's time for us to as well. And it's really important that the rancher doesn't have to pay a bunch for that to happen. And then it's a double bonus that, as we just talked about with climate and environmental stewardship, I mean, this is real stuff, whether we want to believe it or not. And these tags could really help us have real data around, you know, sort of quote unquote carbon hoofprint. You know, what are animals doing out on the landscape? How are they moving? What's the data coming from the soil? How is that going to help us as ranchers? And then also environmental organizations and companies, weather, climate, BLM land management, public land management. How do we make these landscapes this is the last thing, like the beautiful thing is that then this allows us and helps us ranchers become the cornerstone of really, really important work in protecting what we want to protect. And we are often the villain in something that, believe us, we're trying really hard here. And we, of all people, know how important it is to keep these animals on these large landscapes. So we're just going to keep on going.
Well, like I said, you're one of my heroines for doing all that work you're doing. And you know, I want to go back to Arthur for a second. You know, Arthur, you're working with PERC, you know, on a private lands migration research working group. You know, how does the work that you're doing fit into the solutions that Malou is talking about? And you know, what's the intersection and the nexus between the research that you all are going to be doing and the type of work that's going on up in Tom Minor Basin on the Anderson family ranch?
Sure.
Generally.
Well, yeah, sure. Well, so the workshop that you're referencing, which is sort of been co-convened by PERC and me and the Western Landowners Alliance out of the Buffalo Bill Center in Cody, is really sort of was motivated by the sense that there have been these, what we're talking about here has been a gap for a long time, that there have been some significant steps and exciting steps in terms of policy. Examples are the secretarial order that's been referenced out of the Department of Interior back in 2018 on big game corridors in 11 Western states. Another example is the recent Governor Mark Gordon's recent executive order in the state of Wyoming on deer and elk migration corridors. And yet these, while they are very while they contemplate the importance of private lands and instruct agencies to work with private landowners, they don't currently bring, you know, many new ideas or funds to the table when it comes to the private lands piece of this equation. And so this workshop is really saying, look, let's get together an interdisciplinary group of scholars. That's some ecologists, some disease ecologists, some economists, a number of economists, both behavioral and natural resource and agricultural economists, some legal experts, and some folks with experience in federal and state policy. And firstly, just recognize the importance of this issue, sort of further define what's going on here and build a network that can start to advance some new research directions and some policy recommendations. And so we've just had our main first meeting of this group. And I'd say the main activities now are, one has been recognizing that there's going to be some kind of an administration, you know, next year, whether that's a second Trump or a Biden administration, are there some high-level recommendations that we might make with respect to this corridors and private lands piece? On the federal side, particularly thinking about some of the Farm Bill and other private lands-oriented programs. Are there, the second bin has been about tools, and this is getting a little bit more, we haven't had the benefit of Malou's really innovative ideas on this, but it has been, you know, starting to horizon scan and ask questions and develop some new research collaborations with researchers and NGOs that are looking at things like habitat leasing, conservation leasing, which is not a totally new approach by any means, but has not been deployed, you know, with respect to this particular issue of migration corridors. Payments for ecosystem services, looking at what's going on in other wildlife systems and trying to bring some of that thinking to the corridors issue in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. Different types of occupancy agreements that are being piloted, for example, around the National Elk Refuge, and seeing how those can maybe be expanded. So tools, and then the third is research collaborations that are really focused on how we can better basically do what Whitney and PERC have started doing with this report about Paradise Valley, which is what's the sort of next generation sort of migration or conservation assessment that doesn't just show you the maps that I showed you and talk about the threats and risks, but that actually brings in surveys and interviews with private landowners to focus the conversation more on, you know, what landowners are interested in with respect to conservation and private lands solutions. So yeah, that's a synopsis of it.
It's exciting work, and thank you for helping to lead it. We're coming up on the top of the hour, and so I want to start turning to some questions that we've got coming in from the audience. The first one I want to ask you, Dreska. You know, we've talked a lot about the economic costs that elk impose on landowners, but is there an opportunity for elk to also provide an economic benefit, say through hunting and allowing outfitting on a rancher's property? You know, what is sort of the attitude towards, you know, allowing hunting on private lands in the Paradise Valley? And is it something that turns elk from an economic liability into an economic asset? You know, that seems to be a go-to for a lot of people, but how viable is it really, you know, from your perspective as a landowner?
So our experience with hunting, our ranch encompasses 3 different hunting areas. So keeping in mind that there's different regulations and different amounts of tags and different times of year and all of that. So there's a lot of different things at play when we talk about hunting for us. On our summer pasture, we do have an outfitter that leases it for bow hunting. And actually that's a real bonus for us because that means people are on the landscape and they're watching. It's not unusual for us to have wolves and grizzly bears. And so for us, it's a really good way to have eyes on our cattle, and they pay attention and they watch. So if the cattle are sick by any means, so hunting helps in that way for us on that property. At home, we're too small. We have less than 1,000 acres at home. And that's where we have most of the elk interference. Now, by too small, that means we still try and hunt, and we still try and incorporate that. We have worked long and hard with FWP, and there's a work plan for cattle producers in DSAs to use that comes from FWP with a series of tools. And those are hazing, hunting, kill permits, basically. And the hunting that we're allowed to do can range anywhere from a elk management removal, small type of hunt, which is a little hard to put together. But the thing that happened for us is that they extended a hunting season in our area with a special tag if you draw it, that goes till February 15th. So for us, we can actually be taking hunters out for that much time. So we're talking when general season starts, the last week of October, clear till February 15th. So in some respects, it's yet one more burden for us. But at the same time, we are allowing people to hunt and they are filling freezers, and that's a good thing. Ironically, you don't get much assistance from FWP if you do not allow public access. The two are tied for brucellosis mitigation. So it's in the fine print, but you can see it. And it says, you know, we will help you, but the expectation is there that you allow public access. So while we do that, it's very time consuming. It takes a lot of planning because we are small and we're surrounded by subdivisions. So it's a challenge, but we do try and use hunting and are somewhat successful if we have a large influx of elk. But that hunting season stops February 15th, and we have elk clear through May, which is April, May is their critical abortive time period. So it's hard to, we're doing what we can, but it's not helping us when it's really, really important to have elk on.
Mr. Miller, I would ask you the same question. You know, how do you see hunting fitting in as, you know, a way to help mitigate elk rancher conflict in the Paradise Valley? Is it something that you see as being a viable solution? Is it sort of an add-on, but not necessarily part of the core quiver of solutions? You know, where does hunting fit into the equation in your view?
Well, as we heard repeatedly, you know, what Druska's mentioned is, you know, depending on where you run your cows, how you run them, and when you run them, it's all different for everybody. So hunting is one very important tool, and it's certainly the one that the state of Montana relies on to manage the overall numbers. It is extremely important, and the most ranchers in the Paradise Valley express solid support for hunting. What they don't want, as Druska said, is necessarily to be dictated to as to whether or not they will provide access on the terms that the state of Montana dictates, as opposed to working cooperatively with landowners as if the landowner owned the land. It's not rocket science to realize that most of us look at our own private lands with a certain amount of, we might own them. So hunting is very important. It fills a lot of freezers, and it is a very good management tool. The Paradise Valley introduces a lot of youth to their first elk. It is very generous in providing it from everything from wounded warriors to people who have permission to hunt from a vehicle. There's huge support for it, but if it comes with someone driving up Malou's driveway in a truck filled with mud and weed seeds to ask at 6 p.m. the night before the season opens whether or not I can hunt on her property, you know, that gets old really fast. And so we need a more ethical and thoughtful hunter, which we have plenty of. We just need to get rid of a few. The other thing that's a huge impact on the elk herds, probably more than shooting them with bullets, is chasing them in the spring to find their antlers, right at the time when they're all their reserves are down to nothing. But shed hunting has become like this Pokemon type pursuit where everybody loves to do it and thinks that they don't need permission from the landowner, and they can, you know, it's no impact to the elk. So all these things combine, but I think the landowners are very interested in public hunting. They're not looking necessarily, very few of them necessarily want to add it to their quiver of businesses. But it's there's a lot of hunting done now. It will continue to happen, and it will be even more access for public hunters when they, through the FWP, really welcome the landowner as someone who has to be fully in the conversation.
And Malou, what do you say? As a landowner up in the Tom Minor Basin, where does hunting fit into the management of wildlife on your property?
I would agree definitely with all those points. I'm not an expert in all this. I will say, just knowing from stories growing up, our populations have rebounded beautifully. There are a lot more elk up here now than there were when I was a kid. Actually, we stopped hunting elk as a family when I was a kid because it dwindled down to about 15 or 20 we'd see every year on the place. Now we're back up to 100 to 120 head anytime in our back hay meadows. I think so. Just what Whitney said, it's a great way to utilize that meat source. It's a great way to help with the management. Ethical hunting is huge in Tom Minor, especially when it comes to the predators. The last thing we want is someone coming up here, not carrying bear spray, only wanting to carry their guns, so that they, there's sort of a romanticized, there's a story there to be told afterwards. And I know that I'm being very generally speaking and sort of direct, but I've learned from experience that's certainly not the hunter we want in Tom Minor Basin, and probably nowhere around Paradise Valley. He or she is a hindrance to the system, and it makes it a lot harder on the elk as well. So
hunting is part of the solution, but it's not the solution, is the takeaway that I'm leaving with. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to pose it to Arthur. Arthur, we've talked a lot about development and its potential impact on the conservation of migratory corridors in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. Have you come across in your research any example of where a development degraded a migratory pathway? Where we can say definitively that, had this development not been built, that this migration would have more integrity?
The town of Jackson, Wyoming would be one. And we can look at many examples. And to elaborate on that, the Jackson Elk Herd is by many thought or observed or known to have had segments that moved much further south below the town of Jackson into the upper Green, in the Green River Basin, and development, as well as a number of other factors were involved in cutting that off many years ago. So we could look at other examples and work by Joel Berger a number of years ago has sort of done more than I've got off the top of my head to quantify, how many migrations have essentially already been either lost or stopped in some way, or stunted or impacted by development in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem before we got the tools that we now have to watch these much more closely and monitor them closely and detect change more immediately. So lots of historical examples. In my work over in Cody now, it's certainly possible. I mean, one of the big challenges in our work is it's hard to detect what's not happening anymore, right? So when we can look at these animals' movements now, just because they're not using an area now doesn't mean that they didn't use it in the past, but we don't often have the before-after data to be able to detect a change in the migratory behavior of a herd. But it is possible just to look, use common sense, or talk to landowners, or talk to outfitters and guides, or talk to biologists in the agencies who can point out on maps places where, say, in the North Fork of the Shoshone in Cody, Wyoming, you now see, you don't see the loss of the migration, but you can see what looks like these migrations now circumventing subdivisions and development, and sort of having adapted somewhat to get around those. You can see where, winter ranges look like they have a donut, in the middle of them, where these herds, might tend to be up on more of the higher elevation slopes than, down in the bottoms. It's not always easy to answer, the causal questions about why that is, but to the common sense observer, it certainly looks like development has been moving those herds around and crimping their access to key habitats.
And I think Jackson Hole is a great example. That's what we want to see not happen in the Paradise Valley. We don't want Livingston to be the next Jackson Hole and to cut off this key migration route that feeds and sustains Yellowstone National Park. With that, we're out of time, but I would like to thank our panelists for sharing their knowledge and their experience with us today. If you'd like to learn more, please visit us at www.perc.org. That's www.perc.org. You'll be able to find a copy of Whitney's report there, as well as some of our other work on wildlife migration. You can also follow us on Twitter at PERC Tweets. That's PERC Tweets. Thank you very much, everyone, and I wish you a lovely afternoon. Take care.